Now let me introduce our speaker today. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor William Domhoff. He received his PhD in psychology from the University of Miami and presently is Professor Emeritus and Research Professor at UC Santa Cruz, where he has taught since 1965. 4 of his books are among the top 50 bestsellers in sociology for the years 1950 to 1995, including Who Rules America?, The Higher Circles, The Powers That Be, Who Rules America Now, and more recently he is the author of The Myth of Liberal Ascendancy, Corporate Dominance and the Great Depression to the Great Recession, which was published in 2013, and Who Rules America? The Triumph of the Corporate Rich, which will serve as the basis for his talk today. The title of his talk is The Triumph of the Corporate Rich and Why They Succeed. Please join me in welcoming Professor William Domhoff.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. A real pleasure to see old friends and some new faces. My time frame today, when I get to the mundane, will be the 30s to the 70s. The basis is really a lot of archival research that I've been doing over the last 10, 15 years, some interviews that I did in the 80s and 90s. It's a chance, it's a funny thing to be retired and looking back. It's a chance to redo things I did before on the basis of networks and interviews and this and that. Now I go look at the archive. And my basic line is, now I can understand what was going on while we were all too busy to notice, other things that were happening. So it's kind of a do-over. If I go too fast or leave something out, it's mostly there in the following places. I have a website, whorulеsamerica.net, and I have a couple docs on there. One is that I put up in the last year or so. One is on the history of labor. One is on the history of Social Security Act. Lots of archival, juicy kinds of commentary in those. My 2011 book, co-authored, is called Class and Power in the New Deal, and Martine kindly mentioned my 2013 book. I also have an article coming out next month in a relatively new online journal called Class, Race, and Corporate Power, which I like for its title, which kind of summarizes everything I've worked on over the last 50 years, not of my doing in that title. Well, the main actors in my talk today are the corporate rich, a phrase Mills used for a reorganized property class. It's the owners and managers of large income-producing properties. Corporate rich really have 3 parts to them that we'll come across in this talk. One are a set of people I call moderate conservatives, and they have a number of organizations they worked through. One of them I will talk about maybe briefly, called the Committee for Economic Development, who archivally I've also been into. And they're really fascinating because they publish their policy views and criticisms of those views by some of their members. So you can go back and look through those and then supplement that with archive. There's also very ultra-conservative members of the corporate rich. We know them as the National Association of Manufacturers, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and so on. And finally, I'll talk about the Southern rich, but originally meant plantation capitalists, who are very important in all this, and their views are somewhat different on some things than these other 2. However, they all do share one thing: they're totally opposed to unions, and their whole goal in life is to control labor markets. That's more important to them even, I believe, than profits. Power is more important than profits. But then I'm a political sociologist, and I believe that economics is the handmaiden of political sociology. On the other side of the divide, there's a liberal labor coalition that developed in the 1930s. Well, why did this corporate rich, I'm going to claim, defeat the LibLab Coalition so completely? First of all, there's a big picture. Ain't got nothing to do with the 30s to the 70s. It's very important to understand, think of Europe, that there's no power rivals to business in the United States, unlike in various European countries. There's no landed aristocrat. there's no big state elite. You had to have you had to have a pretty organized state or you didn't exist anymore. In other words, that's how we end up with France and Germany. You start out with hundreds of states, and the ones that were able to put it together and join with military force are the ones we know to exist. And of course, we had no big military historically. And I would add this, no big church, no big Catholic church. No church that in 1890 says, hey, we think that workers should have unions. And hence, no Christian Democrats who are, come out of this Catholic kind of tradition. I'm going very fast, I realize, but it's important to understand they didn't have these power rivals. And that meant that when business got bigger and they were aimed at these workers who were now asking to unionize, they had an absolute straight shot at them, an absolute straight shot. And the contrast that's important here, and perhaps in many ways best developed by Kim Voss in Sociology on this campus, is that if you compare the development of the American labor movement with the 2 or 3 countries she looked at in Europe, they were going along about the same. But when the capitalists said it's time to wham bam on these workers, these rival elites in these other countries say, hey, we ain't going to let you do that. And in this country, there's nobody to say that. And so there's a different development of unions in the United States and various European countries. So that gives us a kind of a background, of a big picture background. But there's 2 other factors about America that help the corporate rich to win as well. In other words, they're built-in features of the system that really help them greatly. And these 2 features interact. And the first is that because we have a presidential system and because we have a single member district plurality system for electing people to the Senate and the House, this has a strong push to a 2-party system. A vote for a third party to the left is a vote for your worst enemy. A vote for the third party to the right is a vote for your worst enemy. The Libertarians, incidentally, have cost the Republicans maybe 4 or 5 Senate seats in the last 10 years, and they did cost them the governorship of Wisconsin at one point. So it matters big time, and it means then that if you start a party to the left or to the right, your closest allies will hate you. And I want to use the word hate because I want to remind you back to Ralph Nader in 2000. Because the feminists, the civil rights movement, and so on, did not forgive him for costing them that election. And we can say, oh, Gore wasn't a very good candidate and blah, blah. But the fact is that he won enough votes in New Hampshire and Florida that the other side won. And from the point of view of the liberals, that was a big problem. And to say, oh, well, you could have gone out and won the center or something, it's easier said than done. So this single member district means 2 parties. But it interacts powerfully with another variable. It's historical, and that's the North-South Split, which means 2 different political economies. One producing agricultural products for a world market with first slave and then Jim Crow labor. Very different from the North. And in that context, because once they settled some of their key differences in the Constitution, they still had differences, meaning the well-to-do, the rich, the owners. And the Northerners eventually had what we call a Republican Party, yes, first the Federalists and so on. But the Southern rich from the start had the Democrats and their friends in the North, who were basically outsiders in the North. They were ethnic rich, like Irish at the first, but they were also Unitarians and so on and so forth. And I would submit to you today that the Democratic Party is still the outgroup in America, in its voting and in the people who give it money. They are people that are in various ways excluded by the Anglo-Saxon Protestants, da-da-da, Christians, Catholics, etc. Those white people exclude these other people, including some white people who are Jewish or Muslim or whatever it may be. So you have to understand that the Democratic Party was the party of the Southern rich. And what that means is there was nowhere for a LibLab coalition to go when it did form in the 1930s. And so they had to make a bargain and stay in that Democratic Party. But it was a difficult bargain. In places I've called it a sordid bargain, because you got to just look the other way on straight out racism, which is going to matter when we come to the 1960s. Now, in the Congress itself, because of the complexity of our country, the Democratic Party sometimes does things that the northern rich do not like, and sometimes it does things or wants to do things that the southern rich do not like. And the answer to that is what's called the conservative voting coalition, when a majority of southern Democrats vote with a majority of northern or non-southern Republicans. And that coalition comes together and wins whenever there's a labor issue, a union issue, a regulation of business kind of issue. On the other hand, it does not form on certain key spending kinds of issues. So really Congress is a conservative coalition, which is a class coalition, and a spending coalition, which is broader, which includes the southern rich looking for their subsidies, urban developers looking for their subsidies, the unions, which are glad to be in with the developers and the construction unions. They want subsidies from the big government, and it's where the liberals can go too, because they, as part of being part of this coalition, can deliver for lower income workers and sometimes improve kinds of welfare. Okay, let's look now at this LibLab Coalition, which did develop in the 30s, and I'll come to that. But what has it got? What helps? Why is LibLab not totally creamed, given what I have said? And the answer is big social upheavals. That's the answer. And what does that mean specifically? The Great Depression, which is when there was the organization of the Union Movement, as we'll see. World War II, another big advance for the Union Movement. The Korean War, as you'll see, matters. And the Vietnam War also mattered in a big time way. And if we look at all of that and say, okay, let's remember 1964. Despite all the things I've said the corporate rich have going, and despite all these wars and depressions and so on, or because of them in good part, look at 1964, big victory for LBJ. The conservative coalition was at a minimum in terms of the number of votes it had in that Congress after that 64 election. It was the high point since 1935 for the Democrats, for liberal and for labor. We got Medicare, got big grants to education, diversion of funds into a war on poverty, and so on. Now, this liberal labor coalition, though, and we're going to see this in detail, also has enormous handicaps. It has divisions. It's always had divisions. It's always been exclusionary. Workers face one of two choices. One choice, they can do one of two things. If they can make themselves rare, then they're more valuable. In other words, tight labor market's what they want. And so the AFL's number one goal when it formed in 1886 was to stop immigration. It make them more valuable. And so there's then divisions. But in came immigrants anyhow, and these immigrants were from Eastern Europe, they were from Southern Europe, they were Catholic, they were Jewish, and that adds an ethnic layer because the skilled Republican with the fancier meaning workers were these from the British Isles and Northern Europe. And they were skilled workers. So you got a skilled, unskilled kind of split. But the biggest problem, of course, of all, was the way in which all white Americans, immigrant or not, treated African Americans. In other words, the key final tipping point in my account today is white racism. The point is that there were just enough white Americans, middle Americans, as Nixon called them, not a bad term, turned to vote for Republicans to put Republicans in office. And that made the difference. When Republicans won the presidency in '68, the conservative coalition was revived. The troubles really cascaded from that particular point. And thus the rise and fall of union density and the fall and rise of inequality, which you see on that graphic. So, my graphic is mostly just an outcome variable. It's just a prop in the sense that if you look at that and want to explain the ups and downs that you see on there, I think they're explained by the variables I've just named, but we're also going to see that right now in a historical kind of sequence. Namely, we're going to see when there's a rise in union density and when there's a decline, and we're going to see that the inequality Gini coefficient does precisely the opposite. And the correlation between those two little graphics, one is a Gini for urban male workers, which is the closest stand-in I could find for union. Urban male workers is the one, and the other is union density, and the one that goes back furthest as far as the time series involves, and that means non-agricultural labor. But it correlates pretty close. It's pretty similar to the other measures of union density. I know there's a lot of other intervening variables, whatever you call them, that I'm now going to talk about, but the point is the correlation between those two time series is minus 0.94. Minus 0.94. Well, I also put C. Reg Mills on there on that graphic. After Mills wrote The Power Elite, and he was severely criticized by liberals, by Marxists, by this, by that, by academics, he wrote an answer. And his answer was, he says, I think a lot of people are judging this on the basis of whether they find it optimistic enough or hopeful enough or not. And then he made the quote that I have. He said wrote the thing that I reprinted. He said, first you try to get it straight. I think that's my goal, is to try to get it straight. And then we try to judge it. A lot of things that I say go against my hope, my predilections, and so on, and they certainly go against the predilections of those that hold to big theories that say how history is going to unfold. And so I want to make clear that I recognize some people won't like this story. The small aside would be when I asked numerous friends, I didn't know it was going to be such a great Rorschach test, but I said, what do you think of calling the new version of Who Rules America the Triumph of the Corporate Rich? And several people said, you got to go with what you think the situation is. And others say, you can't do that. It spreads despair. Spreads hope, lack of hope, which I had first been accused of when I spoke at Stanford to what was supposed to be a giant audience, but this was about 70, but lo and behold, there was nobody there. And afterwards, the Maoists really came up and criticized me for my views. But in any case, I'm trying to get it straight. What's the story? How does the story begin? How do I slap all that together? We start with this tremendous depression. It really did mess up all of northern and southern rich. First people that got relief were the southern rich through something called the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was put forth by corporate moderates. Southern plantation guys really loved it, and what it does, it gives money to these big plantation owners in exchange for not growing crops. So it propped them up. It was a straight subsidy. It was a bailout, if we call it today, and it was pretty big. I've compared it roughly with the recent bailout. But it also had another consequence. It was a huge enclosure movement. Lots of everyday workers were then forced off the land, forced into the cities, and that was in a large part African Americans. It was the start of a major dislocation, plus northern movement and so on and so forth in a bigger way than during World War I, and that's going to matter in this particular story. Well, the AAA passed pretty fast, and even though Roosevelt wanted to say, hey, I think we can cool it for now, some business guy said, no, let's go for it. It was called the NRA. And this was going to regulate business. It was going to put a minimum wage. They were going to control prices a little bit. They were also going to control amount of output. And so they wanted this National Recovery Act. But there was one thing to get everybody on board. This shows labor had just enough power. There was a little clause in there called 7A. And 7A said unions have the right to organize. How in the world could that get into this legislation and into later, more important legislation for labor? Well, first of all, there was a little bit of a liberal labor coalition that was for it, and labor really pushed for it. But the key thing was that the liberals, like Senator Wagner, went to the Southern Democrats and said, will you go for this if we leave out your workforce? And the Southerners said, of course we'll go for it under those conditions. So the NRA passed. The ultra-conservatives in the North didn't like it at all. They didn't like 7A. They saw it. The corporate moderates thought they could handle it. No sweat. We've got our little employee representation plans called company unions and so on. And they'd studied it scientifically, and they had social scientists studying human relations and industrial relations. What happened, though, was unexpected, and that was you got a huge upheaval. Piven and Cloward write about this very well. An NRA was then seen as an opening by labor. And in fact, there's a famous statement, John L. Lewis of the miners, he'd have his people go around, and they'd say, the president wants you to join a union. After all, President Roosevelt had signed it. But people would say, it wasn't clear whether they meant Lewis or Roosevelt, but either way, the president wants you to join a union. And so, wow, it's happening. Now, the NRA had a labor advisory board and industrial advisory board. That means the biggest wheels in the country at that time. And so the head of Standard Oil in New Jersey calls the labor guys and he says, let's talk. We got to talk, the big union guy. And they have a meeting. It's been written about. And the head of Standard Oil actually said, let's have a little truce, he even used that word, to get the economy going again, and then we'll talk about this stuff. So now they have an argument, which has been chronicled. And some of the labor guys said, yeah, we'll do that if you say you recognize our right to unionize. Other business guys wouldn't say that. But they come to, long story, got to be short, and that is that they agree that they're going to create a national labor board. It's on a model of what was going on in World War I, in which the big business guys and the labor guys are going to sit there as the tribunal and decide how these strikes are going to be decided, how it's going to be adjudicated. So these big deals sit on this board together. And they do hear a lot of cases, and they're all about real small-time stuff, real small businesses. And they're doing all right. They settle them, and there's actually some unions that are created and so on. But the ultra-conservatives would not go for it. The big steel, big this and that and the other thing. But steel was the best example. Big autos hated it too. And so that basically sank this labor board. But the liberals now met, led by this man, Senator Wagner, and they developed a different plan. Let's put some teeth, basically, into this labor board. Well, the big business guys, and this is where my archival research comes in, I found new stuff, and nobody's seen it before. It's a lay-down hand. I want to just, humbly, immodestly say it's a lay-down hand if you take the risk of looking at it, which no historian or rival sociologist, I have critics, has bothered to do. But in any case, what happened was then that they tried to oppose this, and they failed. Now, they didn't fail the first time, and that's important. That was in 1934. They did not fail. They scuttled the act, and there's archival stuff where it said, I think that labor just gave us their best shot. We're not going to have to worry about this again. But the 1934 elections elected a huge amount of Democrats. And they were back at it again in 1935, and the National Labor Relations Act passed over the overwhelming, total, complete opposition of all business people. Why did it pass? It passed partly because liberal labor was now a coalition. This is where they really formed, 33, 34, 35. They passed it. But once again, the Southerners acquiesced. That's why we got the National Labor Relations Act. We also got the Social Security Act under the same alliance, but here I want to tell you flat out, where I've got even better evidence, that the corporate guys created the Social Security Act. They wrote it. They wrote it. W-R-O-T-E, wrote it. And nobody believes that, of course, but they haven't looked at the evidence. In any case, that all was, the business guys immediately started to put together their goon squads and constitutional challenges and so on and so forth. Nothing quite happened really, though, because the labor guys had to settle some arguments among themselves, which they sort of failed on, but sort of settled. And they had to make sure Roosevelt was reelected. Once that happened, and it was a huge success, the Democrats really won even bigger in 36. Liberal labor is on the march. And there's a huge union upsurge in 38, 37, and 38. It basically goes from 3 million to 9 million people in unions, roughly. Big surge. What happened? It went backwards. Why? First of all, I think most importantly, when the CIO, which was the Integrated Industrial Union, went south, they were going to create racially integrated unions. And they were using sit-down strikes, which are a tremendously potent weapon, which of course got outlawed pretty damn quickly. But at that point, mixed with some other things, namely the court packing, which the Southerners saw as a way to put liberals on the Supreme Court and challenge racial dominance in the South pulled out of the deal. And from that was the start of the downward march. From that day on, the Southern Democrats were unalterably opposed every minute of the day to unions. And that has to be understood. Now, they immediately got into alliance with the ultra-conservative corporate guys in the North and the AFL, which was losing to the CIO. So the three of them essentially create what becomes the Taft-Hartley Act in 1948. We have archival evidence of this. James A. Gross, who has written 3 volumes on organized labor through the eyes of the National Labor Relations Act. Think about whether you've read James Gross or whether you've ever seen him cited. And he's a very respectable, proper guy at the Labor Industrial Relations School at Cornell. In any case, they were ready to do in the National Labor Relations Board 3940. Union density is going down a little bit. World War II saved the union movement from stasis. Strong statement. I don't have much time. And there was a recession in 1938. Roosevelt didn't believe his Keynesians. They balanced the budget. They did other things. Everything they did went against Keynes and was like a giant experiment. And the economy just nosedived again. And in the 38 election, they lost. Democrats lost pretty big in the North and in the 38 election. And so the conservative coalition was revived. There were now enough Northern Republicans to join with these Southern Democrats who had turned against the New Deal. And that, in one way, as you say, that's all she wrote. This goes down from this point onward. But World War II saved the union movement. You don't fight 2 major powers and have to rearm and be fighting the working class of your country. And so there was a standstill agreement. There was a new one of these labor boards that had business, labor, and the public on it, and they essentially replaced the old labor board for the duration of the war. And the unions went from 9 million to 15 million and hit their highest density, which you see on that thing in 1945. But there's something else that was going on at this time, and that is that this was an opportunity for an opening for African Americans, who did play a role in the reconversion, industrialization, and also had some important roles in World War II, including fighting in key battles like the Battle of the Bulge, where they kept the African Americans behind the lines, but all of a sudden the Germans surged on them, and they had to put the African Americans into the fighting, which they didn't want to do. And I think it's needs to be studied about human beings. If I've fought and died for a country, my attitude changes. And indeed, that was one of the key things. Now we have an African American population that's in cities, including northern cities, has a base, and a lot of people that came back had a whole changed attitude about how things were going to be. But post-World War II, the unions lost. Again, they went down. TaftHartley Act was tough on unions. It did cut out lots of opportunities of picketing. So power-wise, post-World War II was bad. And by 1950, using the cautious kinds of economics and so on, lo and behold, unemployment is actually 9-10%, just starting down. And all of a sudden, and I think it was a total coincidence and accident, there's a Korean War. And the Korean War comes as a shock. They get pushed around. They actually get just about pushed right off the peninsula. There's controls then, again, on prices. Big business comes to run the whole defense effort again. And there's very low unemployment. The lowest unemployment we've ever had since World War II. It was down to 2.8, 2.9, 3, 3.1. This was 50, 51, 52, 53. So the Korean War revived the union movement. Post-Korean War, what happened? Down on density, up on inequality. The passage of another act that limited labor called Landrum-Griffin. Key thing was it further limited picketing, basically turned picketing from a potentially kick-ass stop work thing into symbolic kind of act. And that's different than when you can stop goods from being delivered or things being made or shoppers from shopping and so on. So things were going down, and then we have the 60s. We've all heard about the 60s. And there were two parts. One, of course, was the civil rights movement, which in many ways is the culmination of all that's gone before in terms of the out-migration from the South, in terms of a contribution to World War II and an urbanization. But also there's another part that you must understand, which you won't like, and that is you must understand that the New Deal coalition was built on the exclusion of African Americans from the goodies, period. That's got to be understood. It's hard to believe. But in fact, what it did, because the Northerners had to look the other way on the Southern Jim Crow system to keep this alliance, because you needed those Southern white voters, don't you? Do you believe me? Of course you do, because they're all Republicans now. If we'd known then, we might have said, woo, yeah, this is going to be... LBJ knew incidentally. He said, we can kiss the South goodbye for a couple of generations, he said, when he signed the Civil Rights Act. African Americans had no choice because they were trapped in this thing. There was no thing to do but what I would call dynamite the power structure, and it did dynamite the American power structure. The unions were just as atrocious as the South. Seen best in, I think, Kevin Boyle's book on the UAW and the promise of American liberalism, where he beautifully uses UAW files to show how totally racist the rank and file was, even with this very liberal leadership, of course. And, of course, Ruther understood the powder keg that he was sitting on. No unions, no skilled workers, hardly any African Americans among the skilled workers in those unions and so on. So African Americans dynamited that particular power arrangement. And that's a very important part of the 60s and the disruption in the city. But the really important point then next is the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War is important because it again generated unemployment. Good times rolled in the late 60s. There had not been much decline in unemployment till 65, 66. And so now all of a sudden you've got people, lots of people overseas, and you're building weapons again of various kind, and you're spending. And you can't cut the spending that you have in terms of trying to ameliorate the crisis and disruption in the city. Now, the amount of money in the cities that was spent And the war on poverty can be overstated. And political scientists that some of us know well from Santa Cruz, Michael K. Brown, wrote on this in a extremely persuasive fashion in his book on race, money, and American politics in 1999. And so we have this situation in the late 60s then of all this disruption in the cities. We have this tight labor market. We have inflation. Now, this is then a major problem for the economics. And here it gets more complicated, and I'm only going to touch on parts of it, the complication being the international part of the situation. But for now, I just want to say that you got to understand that then the key votes, in 66, the conservatives came back. Well, the party that's out, often comes back in the off-year election. But they were getting more votes in the South. The Republicans are cracking the, quote, solid South. In 68, it all came home. The white vote usually moved over to away from the Democrats. They either voted for the open racist George Wallace, or they voted for Nixon. So the Democrats went from 60% of the vote to basically 40% of the vote, and lost to Nixon like 42 to 41 or some close number, with George Wallace getting other votes, including 7-8% in Ohio and Indiana and so on and so forth. So this is serious evidence of this kind of racial split. And here I should double back one way. I made 64 sound all peachy keen, but in fact, in those primaries, George Wallace won a lot of votes in the North. He won big time in those at Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and in the state of Maryland. A lot of places. But what happened was in 64, the white workers still voted their pocketbooks. In 68, they voted their skin color. They did not vote anti-Vietnam, I would argue to you as an aside, because, in fact, they were very much opposed to the war in many ways, too. It was race, and they voted their skin color. They did not want integrated neighborhoods, integrated schools, integrated unions, or integrated workforce. And that was the all she wrote. Because at that particular point, when the Republicans come in, they are then able to use the Department of Labor and change the National Labor Relations Board in such a way that they totally undercut the construction unions first, and then later other unions as well. And on reverse key rulings that were made in the 60s that I won't have time to talk about unless they come up in question, that actually the Kennedy board had made some liberal decisions that I must confess as a 60s person, we didn't notice. We were too busy looking at all other things. And in fact, the business guys, and this is where my own archival research has come in, they were livid by 62 or 63 about the NLRB, it's called, the Labor Board. They were livid, and they were organizing to change the law. And they very fancy, all the things we now hear, oh God, they got all this money. They had it all then, they were just as organized. They did not win a damn thing until the Republicans got in. That's the important point. Until the conservative coalition got stronger. And that then made it possible to start to do in the unions. The problem was that LBJ did not want to put on the kind of controls that had been used during the Korean and the war in World War II. He tried to finesse that, but at the same time he wanted to continue spending on ameliorating things in the cities. But the Southern Democrats would not let him. The Southern Democrats, the conservative coalition, tried to force a decision in terms of spending in the cities, because they wanted to do law and order, not ameliorative kind of spending. Furthermore, the Southerners would not let LBJ and the corporate moderates do the Keynesian thing. They all knew what to do, which was that you then raise taxes. And especially you should raise taxes in that situation on the well-to-do, which was out of the question, so they were just going to raise taxes on everybody. But there's a liberal Keynesian way to do these things that got wiped out And these people called, that I call moderate conservatives, had a conservative Keynesianism that worked. But the point is, Southerners wouldn't let them pass that tax hike. And they could have made some other, they could have cut spending on themselves. In fact, these corporate moderates I studied, when their policy statements of 68 and 69 are so fascinating because they said, if necessary, we got to cut agricultural subsidies, we got to cut this, we got to cut that. In other words, they're going to cut themselves. They're going to have to cut their subsidies. They weren't going to go for that, not the Southerners and not the ultra-conservatives. And so the system is now out of whack. It's got spiraling inflation, which doesn't really hurt people, ordinary people, that much because the good times are rolling. There's lots of money out there and so on. Jobs for professors everywhere. Drop out of school and be a radical, you can still get a job. There's millions of professor jobs, which disappeared in 5 or 10 years. So that was the key. Now I'll get to the sort of the complicated part that I don't think is fully understood or appreciated. And something I've only really started to work on and be concerned with. In dealing with inflation and with their various other problems, the Republicans were trapped, the corporate moderates, Nixon, who was very much, had their views, he had all those people, those kind of people in his administration. They were trapped by the fact that they still were trying to rebuild Europe. They wanted strengthened capitalist classes in Japan and Europe. They were still worried about the Soviet Union. Now, what does that translate into is that they were in a fix where they're exporting their inflation to Europe and to the world as a whole. They're just ripping inflation through. And these other countries are saying, you got to cool it, or we're going to make you cool it, because we're going to ask you to give us gold in exchange for your dollars. Now, this was a key thing about propping up these other economies that I don't want to try to get into. But you can understand it just if I say, I can constrain the American economy. If I take my dollars, I'm a French person, that it was actually the British that did them worse, we thought it was the French, and I want to turn these dollars into gold. You got to give me your gold. Well, America was running out of gold. But why did it stay on it? It stayed on it in terms of these world issues. What's the problem at home is they couldn't deal with labor fully while trying to deal with basically the empire or fighting the Cold War. They were kind of screwed. And they knew it. And they knew it in the late 60s. And when Nixon came in and he put these corporate moderates in Treasury, he said, okay, what should we do, guys? And they said, hold on as long as you can for these geopolitical reasons, but when the time comes, don't negotiate about the value of the dollar and, a dollar exchange. Close the gold window, it's called. That is, say, brothers, you're all on your own. Your currency is floating. He finally did that. He did that in, I guess it was 71. He put on wage price controls and he floated the dollar. He won't take your gold no more. And this just ripped through these other countries in ways that we shouldn't try to get into, because now the exchange rates just went all over the place. But it strengthened America. So here we are saying, oh boy, they're in real trouble. The economy's about to die. Nixon's move totally empowered him and the corporations, because now they could fight unions at home and they could continue to expand overseas and fight the Soviets and help these other countries to fully recover. Don't forget that at that point they were still thinking World War II mentality. They wanted these Europe and Japan recovered. Now, so this set them loose then. Now they can really take on the unions. But something else happened in the 70s that we don't fully appreciate, especially when we say, oh, the Keynesian economy, Keynesian economics failed and so on. I want to start by saying, you think of the 70s, you think of this unbroken inflation and so on. If I had my little inflation thing on there too, you'd see that actually they got control of inflation by late 72. It was down in a reasonable kind of way through these various measures that they had taken. Here's what happened that's so important. There were 3 external shocks to the system that could not be handled while at the same time fighting labor. Now, what is that going to mean? First of all, there were agricultural shortages that developed around the world. And those agricultural shortages also hit America because Nixon, for geopolitical reasons, had sold a whole lot of wheat to the Soviet Union. Again, part of the Cold War, trying to get some buddies, the fancy maneuvers of foreign policy. And so there were various kinds of shortages, and actually there were new leftist people that I then later came to know, like the future mayor of Santa Monica, Ruth Yanata Goldway. They got involved in these, we won't buy meat, we're going to do this. In other words, there were all these food kind of strikes and so on, not buying over these high prices. Furthermore, many natural resources came up short. This is just a fickle finger of how things work. It wasn't manipulated and nothing. It's just the world and how it's chaotic. But the third one was the real wacko smacko, and that was the oil embargo, which really socked the American economy something fierce, and other economies as well, and sent shock waves. Now, what does that create? It creates what is now called, from 75 on, actually before that, it's a cost push inflation. There's an outside force. It's not demand. It's this outside force that's creating a inflation. And what that does is it drains consumer pockets. That is, if you have to pay more for ag, you have to pay more for oil, you're standing in a gas line, et cetera, that's taking a lot of money from you and going to Arab countries in this case, and Iran, oil countries, and that's out of the American consumer. Plus, because there's now this inflation, it really took off, then you're in a higher tax bracket. So you were now taxed much higher. So there's this tremendous drain on the American economy. But what was needed at that point was demand. You had to have consumer demand. And you had to especially maybe lower the taxes of people with lower incomes. And you had to have government spending. At this point, the corporate moderates said, screw you. We don't want to listen to you no more, even though we have you for our advisors up till now, because we're going to use high interest rates. Now, what do high interest rates do? They throw people out of work. They create unemployment. And that was their preference over paying higher taxes themselves or continuing to grow various kinds of social programs. And they essentially retreated to 2 social programs that subsidize them. One are food stamps, which subsidizes agribusiness, and the other, of course, is the Earned Income Tax Credit, which you've probably just read in newspapers. Big study, maybe at Berkeley, right? No, where did I read it? Anyway, what was it at Berkeley? So here's this study saying, hey, you know what? This Earned Income Tax Credit subsidizes the McDonald's of the world. But we all knew that. So sure, those were the 2 solutions they were for, and there's 4 now, and still are. They love them. So we're in this situation where it should not be high interest rates, but high interest rates are a power issue at this point, and nothing damn do, in my opinion, with economics. And so at that point, they said, we're not Keynesians anymore, because Nixon had even said he was a Keynesian. Their version, which I haven't been able to get into the differences, time, but the point is then, they said, no, we're deserting that. We're really monetarists. We love the Chicago school. Now, if you read it from an academic point of view, they said, oh, those Chicago economists, they had these brilliant arguments, and the Keynesians couldn't figure out what's going on. And that's why the monetarists became so important. I don't believe it at all. I believe that the corporate moderates switched their views, deserted their mild Keynesianism because they wanted to use high interest rates to further discipline the American workforce. And that was the start of the triumph of the corporate rich. The Carter years, which I'm not going to say anything more about, were the absolute triumph in every way, on every issue. Tax cuts, defeat of union reform, on and on. Humphrey Hawkins Act, all of them got shredded during the Carter years. And I think you find a wide range of people saying it. People that I disagree with profoundly, writing about these things from a little different perspective. May I mention Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson with their politically correct but utterly ridiculous analysis of the American power structure. But I do agree with them. We agree that the Carter years were the triumph of the big business. So that's how the corporate rich triumphed. They did triumph completely. You see that in the rest of the graph. They go up, unions go down. And they did it because of these background variables they had in their favor and the white racism that took just enough voters into the Republican Party to finish off the Democrats. Thank you very much.
So now I will take hands and keep your hand up so that I might be able to get a cue. Yes, you may start.
So there's a little bit of a different story that I just wanted to see if you would comment on a little bit. So one, oftentimes you hear the post-war boom really linked to the decimation of international economic competition, and so that gave the working class a little more leverage because the corporatists could afford with this extra capital to give reforms. And then you see the competition reemerge towards the middle of the end of the 70s because Europe's rebuilt, Germany starts to enter the international market, Japan, and so the international competition starts to intensify and major attacks on the working class become much more necessary. Your story, very interestingly, sort of talks about a more nuanced approach. So I'm just wondering if you could explicitly comment on that.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. I think it overlooks, what was happening within this country and some of those other countries. Where I think these corporate moderates come into the picture too, and it's something I didn't have time to talk about, but is in my myth of liberal ascendancy, is you've got to understand that this international world was created by these corporate moderates. They fought like crazy to make it so these big businesses in other countries could sell in this country. They knew this was going to happen. And it was more important to them to have a free enterprise capitalist world and not risk the Soviet Union, China, etc. It's very interesting when you're running, you don't know for sure. See, hindsight's easy in a way. In a way, it's totally easy, too easy. But when you're sitting there, running a business and somebody's telling you about Marx and you read it and you say, well, it sounds crazy to me, but Christ, maybe it's not crazy. I think I better, just in case, be ready. I want to hold on. So the Soviet Union looked pretty powerful. Who predicted it was going to implode, for instance? And China had, communists won in China. So they were very nervous about these things, and that dictated a lot of their behavior. They sold out, essentially, the textile industry in this country, and they said, look, the only way Japan's going to recover, I mean, I'm not making this up, this is, interviews with them, you got to let these foreign companies develop with these simple manufacturing, low wage labor, et cetera, textile. That meant the southern companies, it's like, look, you got about 10 years. You ought to figure out how to streamline your business or move your capital into something else, because your textile industry is not going to be there 10 years from now. They understood that. They planned that. They wanted this international world. This was 1/3 of the world market at a certain point. It's down now some. They had to let these people into this market if they were going to not sink. Now, I said Russia, and I said Soviet Union, I said China. Let's not forget there were big communist parties in Italy and France. That was for real in their minds. And they had supported the Greek government against its communist insurgency in 47, 48, when the British said, we can't do it no more. And in came the Americans. So all of that was going on. So all of that was happening much before. The war Vietnam War, because they didn't slap controls on, did help some workers. But actually the careful numbers are, it was believed at the time, the workers are making a fortune. Those plumbers in San Francisco make $120 an hour. This is an outrage, it would say in the Chronicle. In fact, with the inflation, most of these workers are not keeping up, but some construction workers were. Because these capitalists were wanting to build lots of factories in a boom economy, and there weren't enough construction workers. That gets into a whole then other kind of thing, because what they do, they'd let people of color be trained as apprentices and all, but they wouldn't let them in the union. And then when they really need a lot of work, when the capitalists need a lot of workers and the Republicans come in, they start bigger apprentice programs, and they hire all these non-union workers. And so the unions, by being exclusionary, ended up screwed by these workers that they had trained as apprentices and that the Nixon government had trained. So all of that kind of undercut was going on within the United States. Furthermore, I mentioned the National Labor Relations Board had to make some key decision. One of the decisions was made was that you don't have to open the bargaining agreement again if you outsource. Now that was key, because if we have a union contract and we want to move some of our factory to Mexico or Taiwan in those days, we've got to open a contract with this union and bargain that. They didn't want to do that. And the Kennedy board had said you got to do it. So that change inside the American power structure was one of the reasons they could now go much more overseas. I don't know a whole lot about the international stuff. Just want to say I'm totally skeptical. I don't really believe it, but I'd have to do more research to nail it down beyond what I've said for 73, 74. But I do read some of that stuff, and it just glaze over. And I've also want to say, I've been through this with these same people in the 60s and the 70s. And we were colleagues. And I think they got everything wrong. And so, am I going to trust them again? No.
Yes.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the tipping point comes during the Carter years, all these backgrounds, these factors that you mentioned. Was Carter complicit in this, or would it happen in spite of him? He was irrelevant.
I think he was more irrelevant. I think he was all right on the labor issues and a couple other things, but he knew he couldn't get those by Congress. I mean, to read stuff on the Carter years is really quite fascinating in terms of, he was backpedaling like crazy. And so the unions would come in. The unions can often misperceive, and they thought they could win more than they could. Now, to give you an example of that, when Ford was in office, and the union said, let's go with a certain thing they wanted. And the more moderate Democrats said, no, we ought to wait till maybe we win the 76 election. The union did it anyhow. You know what happened? Conservative coalitions got it. They beat them. But they came back then after Carter was in office. Let me make this assertion to you, and this is a power assertion. The liberal labor movement did not win on a single piece of labor legislation after the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, not a single one. They won on, or seemingly won on, corporate moderates agreed with them, on Social Security. Social Security was expanded. Disability insurance was expanded. The big corporations were for that until the late 1970s. Nixon was for indexing old age pensions, which was the biggest cut in poverty. That did more than anything. And so they were all for that, always. I can show that. It's on my website on this Social Security document. But in the late 70s, they turned against it. And now the same modern organization puts out these screeds against Social Security, any further development of it. So their views changed on that issue, and we know a fair amount about that. So I don't think Carter was a bad guy on that. What Carter was, he was definitely got all of his foreign policy advice from these internationalist corporate moderates. They were members of what's now mocked, the Trilateral Commission, which David Rockefeller did start, and Zabrinsky had been part of and been the secretary to, and he's Carter's foreign policy advisor. But that wasn't what was creating the problems for the LibLab in the United States. That wasn't the problem.
Yes, Tim.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, Bill, I love your stuff. I always loved your stuff. I love your talk. I think a lot of it is right. I just can't believe you give the back of the hand to all economics like that. It's just it's so ridiculous. And it's just as bad as the economic people who ignore all the policies. I can't believe you're doing that. And it doesn't work. I mean, Nixon, you said, well, Nixon in 71, because he devalued, which was a political act, solved the problem. But then the economy still goes in the tank in 73.
What's the last part?
And the economy still goes in the tank in 73 to 75. There's a big recession. There are financial issues internationally, which are not solved just by the deflation. You said, for example, the competition internationally, well, they let it go. Yeah, they did let it go to support Europe and Asia. Absolutely true. That's a decision. But they couldn't control the horses they let out of the barn, and that competition did come back to bite them seriously on the fanny. So I think we got to go back and forth on this analysis, if I may say so, because I just can't let you get away with saying it's all internal in the international economy.
I shouldn't have done that, and I should say what I'm saying. I should say what I mean. Left economists, Marxist economists, use what happened in the 70s to beat on the Keynesians. And of course, so do the Chicago School economists. So I was really saying that, in fact, in terms of what happened, it wasn't Keynesian economics that failed. It wasn't even the Keynesians of that day who failed, who gave the advice to lower taxes, like they wanted to give back Social Security taxes and to keep spending. And they said, your issue is lack of demand. So I think the Keynesians understood a lot more. That doesn't mean I'm a Keynesian. The point is, they understood a lot more. The second thing I was saying that I didn't say clearly enough was, I'm saying that the reason the Chicago School ascended was not because they suddenly had the better of the arguments with the Keynesians. I think they ascended because the corporate moderates chose to now listen to them for their own reasons. Now, why do I say that? Because looking at these archives, particularly a couple, I can't remember the guy's name right now, but the University of Chicago, and it's, of course, in this Myth of Liberal Ascendancy book. The point is that now we come to have a discussion. What happens at the CED, Committee for Economic Development, is we're going to have a discussion of inflation. We got these 4 or 5 Keynesians of various sorts sitting there advising us, and the business guys are sitting there. But at this point, there were some hardliners within the business community, and they said, there's not enough monetary economists here. We got all these damn Keynesians. This one guy's from Berkeley. He's still around, but he went to Brookings. So I saw them eliminate these Keynesians. And one of these guys, I wish I could remember his name, I interviewed him in 1990 over the telephone. And he had been a real young guy, and so all the papers were talking about, boy, he's a brash young guy, and he would argue with them. And when I talked to him about the whole thing, he said, it used to be fun to go there and we'd argue and discuss. He said, it got really bad. He said, they were nasty to me. And finally one of them said, I think you're just a damn communist. This was the head of Alcoa said this to him. You're just a damn communist. He said it got very unpleasant to be there. How many something blocks you want to get it out. But he also hilariously became the head of Carter's Wage Price Control Board, which had nothing. It's a great interview, and I sent him my book, and I think he was really furious. he said, because he didn't write back at all. But the point is, these guys were pushed out. There was a real fight. But I recognize that there are these economic interactions. I'm just really being critical of the belief that the Chicago school somehow ascended on the basis of their brilliant formulations. And I'm also saying that it was a power choice, not an economic choice, to use high interest rates to deal with the problems of the 70s. And I want to come back to that 70s thing. Remember, there was a dip. There was a dip in inflation, and then it came back because of the ag, mineral, and then oil shocks. And then the question was how to control those, and they would not use the Keynesian solutions. And I'm claiming then that they wouldn't use the Keynesian solution because they were more interested in dealing with the uppity American workforce and their union.
I have many people in the queue, so ask your questions shortly, and Bill will have to answer shortly.
Hey, I got to get better at short, don't I?
So, I'm sorry.
No,
Can we
yeah.
take a few at a time?
Sorry?
Maybe take 2 at a time or no?
Well, right now. Let's just try.
I'll do better. I'll say yes, no. Go ahead.
How much do you see as the manufacturing supply-demand problem resulting from increased productivity? There was a boom in productivity from 1913 to 1969. 1969 is the year everything turns around, in which it's electrified mass production, new products, tractors, cars, washing machines, whatever, which then demand saturates because essentially everyone has one of them now, and therefore you're only doing replacement.
No, I don't think so, because I think the question is that you can create demand. I mean, if I'm understanding you right, and I'm not in other words, you're saying, did we get so productive that we were producing too much?
No, I'm saying that the whole range of new goods for the industrial durable goods, lifestyle, houses and car transportation, washing machines and all that model saturated the demand because everyone had a washing machine and a car and whatever.
Yeah.
So
I don't think so. I think that it was there was a lack of demand, and that's the thing that that this one set of people said, but got overridden. So I do think there was a lack of demand. I also think that if you look at it any time, like right now, there's been a lack of demand for a long time in the American economy, but it's been overcome by various bubbles and booms and extended credit cards and all the rest. If you have adequate demand in people's hand, then I think we're going to see shifts where people move their capital to other things. In other words, I think we're going to start building different things or doing more with services and so on. But I don't think the productivity thing was that strong. The other thing I've really, in the last few years, I've got so impressed with using archives and historical stuff and not trying to be about too recent. Because when you actually look at the full numbers, after the facts, you start to look at it a little differently. So I just read a dissertation from 2013 by a young Marxist economist at UMass Amherst named Alejandro Reus. And he's looked at all those numbers on the growth of labor share. And one of the key things in the growth of labor share in the 60s was the extraordinary growth of executive share. In other words, at the very time that they're saying the unions are now getting away with murder, the pay of the higher levels was going up like crazy, and usually that's considered in the labor share. So if you put that in Mills's way, corporate rich, you get another answer. So I think that how we slice those various stats really matters big time, and is used as a weapon in arguments. And so I'm wary.
I am going to go to two now. Larry and Troy.
Okay.
Larry first.
And I appreciate the fact that you distinguish between the northern capitalists and the southern capitalists, and it made the distinction among capitalists. The thing that I keep not hearing is the thing that I keep not hearing about. if you look at the crash of 2008, it plainly takes place most in a sector which is hedge funds and finance and so forth. And we don't hear about them in your story. We don't, your story is about capitalists who, as you say, own property, head of Alcoa and so forth. And the place of this kind of finance capital in the USA, it has increased by, several,
Yeah.
It used to be 10%, let's say, of the,
Yeah.
of
Now it's
the
more.
economy, and now it's 40%. Can you integrate that into your story?
I think so, but let's remember my story today ended in 1974. I quit in 1974, so I'm not talking about all this stuff. This would be an example of what I'm talking about when I say let's be careful. It's very interesting that GE is getting out. I think the Keynesian story on this, I confess to a real bias towards Paul Krugman at this point, as a power analyst as well as an economist. And that is that a lot of these things that happened were due to shadow banking and deregulation. Why was there shadow banking? Because of various kinds of deregulation, which did have a complex international component with this euro dollar, because that's actually the first group of financiers that got free were the British, the city, the Wall Street of England or Great Britain, and they then played a role in aiding American banks, which limited the power of the American government to actually deal with inflation. And it made it very profitable to go into some of those things. I think that's a post-1975 story. And I think I could integrate it in a power way, but it's not part of my story today.
Okay, so I'll go back to the 1930s.
Okay, good.
You have such a big picture analysis, and it's hard to frame a question which captures the full story. So I'm going to go to that pivotal moment in the 30s when there is this Faustian bargain, which you correctly identify, between the Southern Congress and FDR. So it is, on the one hand, the Wagner Act and Social Security, but there's one other feature of this which is critical, and that is the Federal Housing Act.
Yes.
So those three together. Now, why the FHA is so important? Because between 37 and 62, somewhere in there, the housing structure of the whole country shifts over, and it wasn't so much white flight. It was the creation of the suburbs through the FHA.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I agree with all that, and partly because I read it the things you said, but I just didn't have time to put that part of the story in today. But that's the part of the story where I was saying a spending coalition, and I was talking about ethnic and so on. There's some really fine articles on how all that was created. And basically, the real estate interests went to FDR, the Congress, and said, this is what we need. And so they said, government's got to bank this. So they were very pro-government. And the name now comes back of the key guy whose papers I read at Chicago that was part of this CD, who was so damn interesting, was a guy named Phil Klutznick, who was very involved in the 30s government stuff, knew it cold, and then became a developer and became super rich, remained a Stevensonian Democrat, but was taken into the Committee for Economic Development. And he would say, guys, demand spending. I mean, he was, and he couldn't get these other people to go, so you can watch their debate. In other words, you couldn't get them to go along with it. I agree totally with that story. It has to be, that's what I meant when I said the Democrats, there is a spending coalition. It includes a few Republicans. What it does, it spends for what Harvey Mollich's great phrase, and it spends for the growth coalition. There is in America, cities in America are all run by real estate interests, which are a growth coalition. They are a growth machine. And they articulate with the corporate moderates. The CD, Ford Foundation were all with them. Taking Troy's story a little further, what was so important was to have the federal money. This was important. post 55, they used federal money to buy out slumlords so that they could put more expensive buildings on the ground that had been ghettos and barrios and low-income white communities. In other words, what happened that added to the mix of the dynamite of the cities, there was essentially, and mainstream Clarence Stone, political science, has written about this great too. They cleared these neighborhoods to expand the downtown. That was all federal money that did that. And that was absolutely essential. This laps up on our shores because that's what the University of Chicago did. That's what Yale did. That's what Southern Cal did. They all needed more land. They were afraid of the African American neighborhoods, and that combination led them to get huge amounts of money from the federal government. That was the Democratic coalition with the Southerners. And I will add the dynamite variable, I've said it before, and that is you've got to understand that the people that were running these growth machines are ethnic Americans that were excluded by WASP, period. This means Italian Catholics, it means Jews, it means other Catholic groups, Irish, are excluded. They were in the coalition with the Southern Democrats. They had no use, these ethnic Americans, for African Americans any more than the Southern Democrats did. But that was the huge spending. It was a huge amount of spending. And it totally changed American cities in a dramatic kind of way, and added to the whole volatility then of the mix of the cities.
The very, very last question, and I know I have two on the queue. You're just going to have to ask your question after our formal time is finished. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah, I want to stay in the 30s. I think you hit on a very important point, the idea that the gains that workers made were really through their own struggles, but then sort of jump over what causes or how you account for lack of a better term, the class collaborationism of union leadership, and the sort of the nail in the coffin being McCarthyism, which you don't mention, that drives the people out of union positions who were really in the leadership of the struggles of the 30s going into the 40s.
Yeah.
Obviously, we can say, yeah, there's an anti-communism, but what's your explanation for succumbing to that when it was clear that the only way people were going to make any gains was through a broader, unified struggle that also began to really undercut the racism that had been maintained and was beginning to be overcome in a lot of the unions?
Well, yeah, that's a long, good question, and I think that that there is evidence that the industrial unions were, as you say, and Judy Steppen Morris and Recycling book on the unions read something. Anyway, I think that tells the story with quantitative data as well. But I think what happened in the 30s is really that these two very mainstream union leaders, John L. Lewis and Sidney Hillman, had their own reasons to want industrial unions, because they really, to protect their unions, they had to get other things unionized. Particularly in the case of Lewis, he had to get the steel companies unionized. I think that what happened that was key and ironic, and I have a lot of this in my co-authored book on the class and power and the New Deal, the communists played a very complex role in all this. Many times they screwed things up, and I'm going to get to that. But in the 36, one of the problems that Lewis and Hillman faced was they had no organizers. But the communists, because they'd been out having their own separate unions, were great organizers, and they were courageous. They thought because of their ideology, their temperament, and so on. Anyway, Lewis hired him. Lewis said, "Will you be my organizer?" So there were a lot of communists, but also socialists that were the key organizers in this union. And we now know, this is hilarious, we know from Soviet files, but also American spying files, we know that the Soviet Union permitted the American communists to be involved in this union. And now they wanted to be involved. This story is great. It shows you how human it all is, how iffy. So the American communists knew that it would be good to help develop this CIO. But they also ultimately had to get permission. So they went to Moscow, a guy named Hathaway, and his whole speech is there and so on, one of these books on all these communist files. And he argues with the Politburo. And the Politburo decidedly says, okay, I guess you're right. You guys shouldn't do this. So they then got into the union movement. But I don't think that the capitalists would have been defeated. I think the union leaders were actually cagier. I'll go with Melvin Dubosky on this, where he wrote that they were not so turbulent years in many ways. People were still mostly in their routine. And I would say that I think the capitalists fully believed that they could win a street struggle. They had armed to the teeth. They had spies everywhere. They were itching for a fight. And if there had not been a thing called the La Follette Committee that exposed all this, and it was known as in congressional records in the 30s, there might have been such an armed struggle. Workers never won anything in America, nothing, unless the federal government stopped the violence. In other words, that's why Roosevelt was so important. That was the first, the Flint strike was the first time in American history that a major strike had not been ended by organized violence, either by Pinkerton detective or by the federal government. So I think that the capitalists felt they still had control of those kind of things. What happened with McCarthyism, what happened to the unions, I have a little different view. And it relates to this third party thing. And that was that the communists were saying, we're not going to do a third party in 48. Even though Wallace wants to do one, we're not going to do one. The Soviets, in I think it was October of 47, said everything must be done to stop the Marshall Plan. They had some other things they were really upset about. How you do it, it's up to you. The American communists on their own did a total about-face and worked to start that party. Even some of the people who later were thought to be liberals were communists. They developed that party. Some of the union leaders who were communists hated that. And they said, this is the dumbest thing in the world. They, of course, told the head of the CIO, who had his own spies anyhow. And they said, you do this and you're done. And that was the end because they did it. They went out and backed Wallace. And from that day forward, the union movement moved to expel all those people from that union. I don't think it was McCarthy. I think it was a mistake of starting that third party. And on this, Maurice Zeitlin and Stephen Norris say the same thing. That is, these people were fiercely militant. They did a lot of things to help organize these unions. But when they started that third party, and without question they did, although Wallace wanted to do it, he had nobody if he didn't have them, then they lost. And they were forever hated by the other union people. And I think you have to understand that about liberals and leftists. They do hate each other. But it's not all just because the liberals are namby-pambies is one of the things that I think I've learned in these records and so on. Is just think how infuriating it was to all feminists, all environmentalists, all people of color, civil rights, when Nader would not leave that race, even though sociologists that knew him, like Harry Levine, said, drop out. He wouldn't do it. These people hate him. And that's what happened to the communists in 1948. And I think if you lose sight of that, then you immediately say, oh, those namby-pamby liberals or those damn union leaders, they sold out. No, those union leaders were afraid to death of one mortal thing, and that is anything that could get their union destroyed. That's the number, and we know that sociologically, right? You don't want your organization destroyed. You don't risk your organization. Now that looks pretty, wimpy, maybe, from our side of the fence. But if you have struggled to get this union and have working hours that are decent and make money, you're not going to risk that for what they thought of as pie in the sky. So I think it's a very tricky thing of what happened in the 30s, and the capitalists had to be restrained. They at least wanted to fight, no question.
Let me take this opportunity to thank Bill for a wonderful
May I ask you a quick question?
Pardon me?
May I ask a quick question? So I know you said that there's some
Wait
disagreement.
a minute. I gotta switch to my other mic because with all this background noise, I'm gonna be screwed.
Okay.
So now I'm gonna switch my. Go ahead.
Okay. So you say that your interpretation of power differs from people like Pearson and Hacker.
I gotta keep getting.
Okay, it differs from like Pearson and Hacker. In what way? What is the difference between your presentation of what's happened versus what they would say?
They way underestimate all the things that were going on in the 60s on race and on the union. And they even say that racial story is too easy to tell. And it was all about, in the late 60s, for the first time the capitalists got angry and organized, said enough of this stuff, and they started a business roundtable. I critique